is well. It is well with my soul.
Amen. You may be seated. It's always a hard song to sing, isn't it? I mean, if you're going to sing it with integrity, with honesty, I mean, it's nice to tell the story of someone else's tragedy and the faith that it produced. And somehow, even when we're telling these stories, we do so in a way that makes us think, okay, whatever my circumstance is, it's going to be okay. And that's part of what faith is. But singing that song and songs like it with honesty, with integrity, means we've got to look at the wildernesses and the brokennesses of our own life and ask ourselves, can I say in these moments, it is well? It's well. I don't know about you, but there's times it doesn't seem well. Have you sensed this? I've been griping of late about a general sense in the church at large, not our denomination or even our local church. I'm not saying we're exempted from it. I'm just saying I'm not speaking very narrowly. I'm speaking very broadly. It seems like within the church at large, there is a loss of ability to suffer well. It seems like this is the case in the world. I don't know. It seems like we've become more fragile than ever. And we like the stories. We like the movies. Those are the best movies, you know. The hardships endured. The trials walked through. And on the other side of it, we liked the ending of it. And we can watch these movies and read these books and sing these songs and sometimes think, okay, this is what the character of my life is going to be like. I'm going to be like one of those. I always see this in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. For the record, for those of you that are geeks and you like both Tolkien's books as well as Peterson's adaptation of them, you'll appreciate why the hero of the story is not, nor was never ever intended to be Frodo Baggins, the hobbit who actually carried the ring. The real hero, J.R.R. Tolkien said, of the story is Samwise Gamgee, the companion to the journey. Because when we're in the wilderness, what we need is someone who will walk with us. This is what we've been singing about. It's what we've been talking about. It's what David was writing about. And believe it or not, it's what the remainder of 1 Samuel is about. So I'm doing something weird today, which is normal. Me doing something weird is normal, and if you do weird things with some predictability, then they stop being weird. I'm trying to normalize weird. This is my goal. But we've been in the book of 1 Samuel, and it's carrying us all through the month of June. In the month of July, we will be continuing the story in 2 Samuel. We're looking at the life of David, essentially. But something interesting happens in the book of 1 Samuel. Right at the end of 1 Samuel chapter 20. I'm going to talk more about this story in later on in the message, but something happens. David goes on the run. You remember Saul, the king. Again, we'll revisit some of this. Saul, the king that Samuel chose. In a sense, the king that the people chose, not the king that God chose. Saul the king is jealous of David, who was secretly anointed as king. He becomes jealous so much so he becomes so jealous of David that he tries to kill him. As you're reading through 1 Samuel, pay attention. Every time, especially after 20, but certainly even before, every time we encounter Saul, he has a spear in his hand. Like he's literally sitting in court. David is playing his let's say it's a guitar. He was playing his guitar, playing some music to soothe Saul's troubled spirit. And Saul, more than once, tries to pin David against the wall with a spear. Why does Saul always have a spear? It's always there. And every time you find David, he's got nothing to defend himself with. In fact, one of our stories, we're not going to read it today, but he goes to this kind of enclosure temple that seems too big of a word, but this place where some priests in the land were ministering. And the priest on duty asked David, he says, "So what weapons do you bring?" David's like, "I've got nothing." Of course, he left that place with Goliath's sword, which is awesome. But you'll see this. Saul always has a spear. David is always powerless. And something happens in verse 20. Saul's jealousy takes over. And where he's been trying to kill Saul, now it becomes a concerted, vocalized, not secret anymore effort on his part. And David, at the end of chapter 20, departs into the wilderness. 1 Samuel has 31 chapters. And 20, 21, all the way through 31 is David on the run. So here's what I'm doing weird. I'm not preaching from a text. Oh, I've got my verses in front of me, but I'm not taking apart a text, telling that story of that particular moment, whether it be at the priest or in a city where David presents that he is insane. And I'm not telling those stories. Instead, we're going to be looking in large, in principle, at this idea of navigating the wilderness. What does it mean to live in the wilderness? And that's really our starting point. It's going to be a principle applied to both this week and next week, but it begins all with a four-letter word. And this is where my whole family sweats. Here's the four-letter word. It begins with the word life. Four-letter word. Well, and we use it like a four-letter word sometimes, don't we? Well, that's life. And we mean not, well, that's good, or I'm happy about this. We mean that four-letter word to sound in those moments a little bit like a four-letter word. We say it sometimes with a shrug of the shoulders. The way we dismiss our circumstances, whatever they may be. Something bad happens, well, that's life. Something unpredictable happens, well, that's life. And really what we're doing is we're pointing out how quickly life can go sideways on us. Isn't it amazing? Everything can change in a moment. Irrevocably changed, irreversibly changed, and it can happen so quickly that you are one person one day and something so profound has happened that it fundamentally changes who you are in the next moment, in the next day. It can happen just like that. Maybe it's the loss of a job, right? Maybe it's the death of a family member or a friend. Maybe it's a diagnosis. Maybe it's that child whose choices are causing their life to fall apart, and all you can do is watch. Maybe it's the child whose life is falling apart through no fault of their own, and all you can do powerlessly is to be there. And as a parent, all you want to do, as a good father, all you want to do is help, but you're powerless to do anything. All you can do is watch. Have you ever felt these moments, these wilderness moments when everything changes? It's those moments when everything changes, it seems suddenly, but it's also those moments when things have changed slowly, but we seem to recognize it in a moment. You ever experience this? When it's this idea that we live through the slow, relentless movement of time itself. Time changes everything, including us. It's that movement from the past that is fixed in time. Nothing's going to change about that except maybe my memories on how I retell the story. But there it is. It's fixed. It's in the past. I can control this. Like, this is why I think we like the past, is because it is what it is. And all we have to do is acknowledge it. There's something containable and controllable about this, but time continues, and it becomes overwhelming when we realize time ticks away into the infinity of possibilities in front of us. Sometimes the future is too overwhelming, so we rely on the past. But it's that moment, maybe, when the slow, relentless movement of time has caused you to wake up in the morning, go into the bathroom and get ready, and you look in the mirror, and all of a sudden you don't recognize the person looking back at you. When did I get gray? When did that happen? Was that overnight? When did those wrinkles start to show? What happened? I don't remember seeing this happen. And then one day I look in the mirror and there it is. Have you felt that? It's the moments when life is life. Well, that's life, we say. Something happens. Maybe it's unexpected. Maybe it leaves us spinning in a circle, not certain which way is forward. Maybe it's just the next chapter in the story. We say this phrase a lot. It's life. Frank Sinatra even sang about it. Did you hear that one? I like Frank Sinatra. His messaging is not very appropriate. Like, I like secular music. Do you know Frank Sinatra is too secular for me? And that's saying something. That is saying something, because his music comes at us in a way that it sounds pretty and we like it and we want to sing along. And if you're singing along, you go, oh no, that's not how this is supposed to be. Right? But he wrote about it. You remember the song? He sang, that's life, that's what it is, right? That's what all the people say. You're riding high in April, shot down in May. But I know I'm going to change that tune when I'm back on top in June. You see how he defines life. That's life when bad things happen. When I'm not on top, when I was riding high one month and it all falls apart the next month, that's life. But don't worry, I'll be back on top next month. Sometimes life doesn't afford us that reality. I think in a sense he had it wrong. So what about all of this business of life? It's a big word for such a small word. Doesn't it seem like we're using that word in exactly the wrong way? Jesus said, I've come to give you life and life more abundantly. And we're like, well, that's life. It seems like we're using this word exactly opposite of what it's intended to be. Interestingly, if this gathering today were actually a funeral service, this would be a good time for some cheeky comment about how sometimes it feels like our churches are really just becoming a mausoleum for the not quite dead. If I were going to add a cheeky little comment, that would be probably the comment I would add, but I'm not going to do that today. But if this assembly were a funeral, one of us, whether it's the officiant or a eulogizer, one of us would probably say of our deceased, well, they really lived. You know, they lived life. We would say something along those lines, but we tend to only say that sort of thing about life like it's a good thing at funerals. Otherwise, life seems to not be a good thing. It's just life. But then we get to a funeral and we're like, oh, it's life abundant, and we should live our lives like the deceased. All the while, we're sending mixed messages. So I think we need death in order to understand life. I think that's why we say it in these funerals. I think we sit in view of mortality and brokenness, and we say there's got to be something better than this. But then the funeral concludes. The blessing is given by the pastor. Another Sunday has passed. Monday rolls around. And it's not 11 o'clock, and we go, oh, that's life. I think there's something better. I think there's something more. I do think we need to be confronted with death, with wilderness, with desolation, in order to truly understand what the opposite is, what life is. So maybe that's the point. Life is the flower that blooms on the edge of a cactus. Life, in a sense, is sorrow's bloom. Life is what we finally see when we are confronted with death. Oh, that we didn't have to see death in order to understand life, but it seems like we need to do this. Life, it seems, is only ever finally appreciated when it's all threatened to go away. Isn't that the way it goes in our life? We never appreciate what we have until it's threatened to be taken from us. That's why I think we need these things. To my mind, then, we need a stronger word than life. Something that carries more weight. This idea for the sermon title and everything, I wish I could say it was mine. It's not. It's a borrowed idea from a book that I've not read and from a movie that I've not seen. It was quoted in another book that I'm reading, and I was like, oh, that's a great quote. So I'm going to give you the quote without any context because I have not read the book or seen the movie. But this idea of needing a stronger word for life comes from the book Dr. Zhivago. Some of you have seen the movie, 1965, right? Omar Sharif was in that, as well as Alec Guinness, right? The guy that played Obi-Wan Kenobi for my geeks. He was in it as well. But apparently in the book, this line is in there, and it seems to resonate. Here's what it says directly from the book. How many things in the world deserve our loyalty? Very few indeed. I think one should be loyal to immortality, which is another word for life, a stronger word for it. Immortality, a stronger word for life. And then he continues, he says, one must be true to immortality. And then he finishes with these words, true to Christ. Oh, I like that a lot. How many things in the world deserve our loyalty? Very few indeed. I think one should be loyal to immortality, which is another word for life, a stronger word for it. One must be true to immortality, true to Christ. And this is where we find ourselves today. We need a better word, a stronger name. So bear with my philosophical decline for a moment as we prepare to enter into the text. Here's my philosophical decline. I think immortality, whenever we speak of immortality, it's just a way for us to speak about death in a roundabout way. You see, if no one ever died, if nothing ever died, we would not speak of mortality. We wouldn't know what that is. Adam and Eve, prior to the fall, would have had no concept of death. On the day that you eat this fruit, you will surely die. What does that mean? They wouldn't have known. So when we speak of immortality, we're speaking of it in contrast to mortality. The only way we can know immortality in our limited perspective is by understanding immortality's opposite, mortality, our own and the world around us. You see, death helps define what it means to be alive. And here's what I have observed in the church and in this pastor. It seems like we are good at carrying our death with us in our bodies, as Paul would write about in Romans. But we have become complacent and unable to bear the burden of the wilderness. We carry our mortality, but we want our death without having to change our life. This is where it seems we are, and it has created a despair in our life, a despair in our culture. We who have so much have almost no idea what it means to be in need. We have lost, in the abundance of life, a view of the immortal. And the depressing part about this is, and the ironic part about this is, as it seems to me, in our abundance, in our blessings, in our world that we inhabit with so many haves, we have actually found that we are filling our own caskets with flotsam, with minutia, with garbage. And the more only ever seems not to make us more alive, but make us more dead. The more of what was promising to give us life only ends up promising death. Do you sense that despair? I feel it. I feel it in my bones. I feel it in my gut. I feel it in my soul. And I look at the despairing church. I look at the powerless church. I look at the aweless church. We don't stand back in awe and wonder anymore. It's all been seen. It's all been done. It's all been tried. And it's all very boring to us. It seems like we're dying a death of attrition. Well, that's life. We need a stronger word, I think. This is why I think so much of the biblical narrative involves wilderness. You cannot read the Bible and escape the wilderness. It's there from the very beginning. The Judean wilderness was, you see, an unrelenting place. I learned an important statistic this week. I have no idea how its relevance with the message, but it was intriguing to me. In the Judean wilderness, more people, the way most people die, it's not heat exposure, it's not dehydration, it's not exposure to the elements or starvation or falls off rocks or anything else. Do you know how most people die in the Judean wilderness? Water. The flash floods. This is why Jesus said, it's a fool that builds on the sand. I just thought that was really interesting because all of the ways that we plan, all of those things that we think are going to kill us, all of those things that we're warring against and mitigating our lives against, at the end of the day, are almost always not the thing that kills us. The thing that kills us is the thing that surprises us. So we come to this Judean wilderness. Throughout the Bible, the wilderness is the place where scapegoats go to die. Remember that? It's the place where scorpions and vipers live, even broods of vipers, as John the Baptizer would comment in one of his sermons. The wilderness is where water and food are all that you really need. That and some shade, some shelter. The wilderness is where you go to learn dependence upon God. The wilderness is where you go to watch your old life die and your new life emerge. The wilderness is the place, you see, of undoing. It undoes all of those things that you thought defined life. The wilderness, one by one, takes these things away from you and says you really didn't need that to begin with. The wilderness is our place of undoing, where survival means learning to adapt, learning to listen to the environment, learning to hear that singular voice of God who is always calling. In the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight the paths. That voice of God. You see, the wilderness is the place where the wind whistles, and the one who staggers through the wilderness is finely tuned by the circumstances to really hear the voice of God in the barrenness of life. Maybe we don't hear God because we filled our life with too much death, and we have drowned out that sacred voice. The wilderness has been a part of the story from the beginning. Adam and Eve were like we know. They were kicked out east of Eden into the wilderness with thorns and thistles. But did you know wilderness was actually part of their life before sin entered into the equation? Remember, God said, I have planted you in this garden. Now, as I have planted this garden, you be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. That doesn't mean abuse. That doesn't mean obliterate. It means to steward. Fill the earth and steward it. As I have brought order out of the chaos, so too you who bear the image of God, you are to go out of this place and bring a kind of creation out of the barrenness. This was part of our calling. Wilderness is always been a part of our experience. It is not just a consequence of sin. Oh, to be sure, sin changed how we interact with the wilderness, the thorns and the thistles and the death of the ground, but we were always called to the barren places. Always. Always. Even Abraham and Sarah, they heard the voice of God to leave the land of their fathers, to go, God said, where I will show you. Can you imagine starting a vacation that way? Where are we going? Wherever I drive to. Right? You're going to like it, right? This is how he started. Where did it lead him? It led him through the wilderness. It led him into the wilderness. This has always been part of the story. How about the Hebrew slaves in Egypt? 430 years, God heard their cry. And he brings them out. He says, I'm going to deliver you. I'm going to deliver you to a land flowing with milk and honey. A land of abundance, a land of fruit. I'm going to deliver you from this slavery. I'm going to bring you to this land of promise. All you have to do is walk through these two walls of water. Come out on the other side, and do you remember Exodus chapter 14? They start singing a song. They come out on the other side singing a song, and they're all happy. 2 days later, they're not so happy. Because it turns out, even coming out of slavery, you have to go through the wilderness. We should have gone back to Egypt. At least there we could eat. I know we were slaves, but at least we had food. Moses, you don't even provide food or water or anything. Isn't it amazing? Even then, they had to walk through the wilderness. John the Baptizer, where do we find him? As a voice of one crying in the wilderness, Jesus said, make straight the paths of the Lord. The message of redemption first comes in the wilderness. Because where else do we need to be redeemed except in those dry and deadly places? Why do we hear the gospel message first proclaimed in the wilderness? Because the wilderness is where we lost our way. That's where the gospel belongs. It belongs with the broken and the lost people. The wilderness is where we are lost, and the wilderness is where we are found. And even Jesus, when he began his public ministry, it started with a baptism, an inauguration into this public aspect of his ministry. And I love the way Mark tells us, as it says, as Jesus came up out of the water, immediately, the Spirit of God drove him into the wilderness. The Spirit of God drove him into the wilderness where he was tempted, he was tested, and he was tried by the devil. In the wilderness, Jesus' call was refined. In the wilderness, Jesus' faith was tempered by the heat of the desert as well as the voice of temptation. And he came out of the wilderness with a clear focus, with a clear mission. And if you read the Gospels after those 40 days in the wilderness, it says in all instances, and Jesus began to preach the kingdom of God coming. From that moment, The wilderness was beginning to lose its power, but we must walk through the wilderness. It's not optional. The wilderness is the place of dying where life may finally be found. The wilderness is a place of dependence where you cannot provide for yourself. The wilderness is the place of wandering, of lostness, where you cannot make your own way, where you need someone who knows the way to show you through it. That's life, we say. We really do need a stronger word because the wilderness is part of life. So, it brings us to David. You know the story. 1 Samuel chapter 21, all the way to the end of chapter 31, David is on the run, and he's on the run in the wilderness. If you've been back with us the past couple of weeks, we've just glanced at the circumstances surrounding David's own anointing as king. Of course, hopefully, at this point, you know some of the story, but I will review bits and pieces to help us navigate. You see, Israel demanded that they get a king like all of the other nations. We're always vying to be part of the crowd. And there it is. God knew that one day Israel would want a king, and he even knew that one day they might even need a king. Deuteronomy 17 makes provision for that. So God wasn't against the idea of a king. God just wanted to make sure he chose the king. This was God's person for the job. But the people demanded a king, and they wanted a king on their terms. Isn't that how it always goes? I think so often that we vote for the people we vote for because we think we can control them. And this was true with Israel as well. And God allowed it. And the king that they got turned out to be the king maybe that they didn't want. But they couldn't know it at the time. And certainly the king, he was a king that they didn't need. And that's usually how it goes. When we choose those things that control our lives, those kings that command obedience from us, we always choose wrong. You ever notice that? We always choose wrong. Consider some of those things that control your life, those so-called kings. We could name them Sauls. This kingdom of Saul in our life. These kings that you continually bow before. All the things we bow before. Power and prestige. We bow before wealth. We bow before comfort at almost all costs. We bow before self-protection as the paramount virtue. Why do we vote the way that we vote? Well, the economy, because we want to feel financially safe and secure, or the borders, because we want to feel nationally safe and secure. We are always looking to bow before this God of safety and security. Well, let me tell you that God does not exist in the wilderness. And so here we are, all these things that control us, all these things that shape us, that make us, they begin to define us, and they are all death. This is the story of Saul. It's the story of us. His reign was not what God wanted, but the people insisted, so it's what they got. Instead, God had chosen a forgotten shepherd boy, the 8th son. Already he was an outcast because 7 is the perfect number. The 8th is just kind of a throwaway in biblical language. And where do we find David? Well, he's the katan, the runt. That's the Hebrew word. He was the runt out in the field. And when Samuel says, "Are these all of your sons?" Jesse, the father, is like, "Oh yeah, I've got one more. Almost forgot." This is David. This is the king that God chooses. Samuel, the prophet, had secretly anointed David's head with oil, an act of king-making, but Saul still held the throne. This is the way it is in our life, where we have this Christ who is our king, but it still seems like other things are on the throne around us. And then somehow David, if you've read the story, David becomes instrumental, pun intended, in Saul's court. playing instruments, soothing Saul's tormented spirit. And then eventually he somehow becomes a military man for Saul as well. Saul keeps sending him on expeditions. He becomes, in a sense, trusted in the court of the king, sharing the king's table even. But the people like David, and David's notoriety builds. Saul becomes jealous. Something in Saul's spirit knows that he is an invader to the throne that really belongs to David. And so it becomes animosity. He begins to seek to kill David. This brings us to the end of chapter 20, verse 42. Jonathan, Saul's son, had become a covenant friend of David's. Covenant friend. Not just like best friends. They didn't wear matching bracelets. They exchanged blood. They were covenant friends. And something happened where Jonathan realized, my dad really does want to kill you, David. And David was like, yeah, I've been trying to tell you. And we come to the end of chapter 20, verse 42, and it ends with these words. And David rose and departed. And Jonathan went into the city. This is where I want to bring some application for our wilderness. What does it mean to navigate the wilderness? In case you don't know, you're going to have to navigate the wilderness. In case you don't know, it could be today, it could be tomorrow if it hasn't been already. It could be a day, it could be a week, it could be a season of life. There are even those tormented people who it seems, Jeremiah the prophet and others, who it seems like this is their whole life, the wilderness. But if you haven't encountered that, just know you will. So we need rules to help us or some advice to help us navigate the wilderness. And this is what I want to pull directly out of 1 Samuel, not just in one place. I'm gonna pull out 3 different verses to give us some ways of navigating the wilderness. Here's the first thing. And we read it there from 1 Samuel 20:42, where it says that David rose and departed. We could add into the wilderness, and Jonathan went into the city. Here's the first thing. Wilderness is departure. You cannot be in the wilderness and be somewhere else at the same time. You know, there is a saying I despise. There's a lot of things I despise. Here's a saying I despise. And once I say this, it's going to ruin it for you too. You know the saying, well, he just wants to have his cake and eat it too. I hear that statement and I go, yeah, that's why you make a cake. Duh. Like, yes, you don't bake a cake and say, oh, I baked this, I just don't want to eat it. No, we always want our cake and to eat it too. That is the whole point of a cake. But when it comes to the wilderness, we're not in the wilderness and outside of the wilderness at the same time. We inhabit one space. And what that means is when God calls us into the wilderness, we must depart that life before. We've got to leave some things behind. There comes a time when we must leave behind those things that have defined our lives. You see, we do not create suffering in our lives. Like if you hear the sermon and you go, okay, I need to go create my wilderness. Well, no, you're just a masochist, and that is a psychological disorder. You don't create pain for yourself in order to get into the wilderness, but as Christians, we do not shirk the wilderness when it is before us. And what that means is all of those things that have defined our life before that moment, we have to leave them behind. There is a departure point in our life. This kingdom that Saul has reigned over, where we've been part of, we've been complicit in, there comes a point when we must depart. And we must go into the wilderness. We've got to leave it all behind. Have you found those points in your life? Have you found those points even sitting in a church when you look at all of the rigmarole and you go, you know, I'm kind of over it. Kind of done. I remember driving to the venue where Jake and Anna were married last Saturday, and And I passed a Church of Christ on the way. And I looked at the sign and I kind of laughed to myself because I was in the car by myself and it would have been weird if I was laughing to anybody else. But I laughed to myself because as I drove past that sign, I thought this has been kind of the despair in my life. It said Church of Christ, and I thought to myself, it should read Church or Christ. And then I thought maybe our sign should read not Church of the Nazarene, but Church or the Nazarene, because sometimes we get so bound up in the brokenness of our systems where Saul seems to be king, the religion that is supposed to give us comfort, that we have forgotten that padded pews and air-conditioned sanctuary is not what God has called us to. There are things we must depart in our life. It's about growing up. It's like a child who has been raised in a home where all their needs have been provided for as well as most of their wants. But life entails so much more than just the ease of always needing your parents to take care of you. You see, there comes a point in every maturing person when it is time to depart the simplicity of a childish faith. Notice, I didn't say childlike faith. That's a different thing altogether. But that childish faith, there comes a point when we must discard it and discover what faith really looks like, when survival is more than just spiritual aphorisms, more than just a nice Bible verse, more than just clean and tidy answers, when the life of faith is a messy walk through the wilderness of brokenness. We need those times. But it's about growing up, and it's about departing where we have been. That's why I love what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13, that famous love chapter. He wraps it up by saying, when I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child, and I reasoned like a child. But when I became a man, I gave up childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now we know in part. Then we shall know fully, even as we are fully known. You see, the wilderness is the only place where the fog that has dimmed the mirror of God's reflected glory is begun in our lives to be wiped clean. Oh, we have so many things blocking our image of God. The wilderness takes them all away. There needs to be a point of departure in our life. Some of you, like me, live in these blessings that we have as Americans, as a developed world power, even as Christians. And we think that this is the warp and the woof of the Christian life, and you have found yourself growing very discontent. Maybe you need to depart that childish way of life and enter into the wilderness that is before every believer. It's part of our journey. It's time we leave some of the childish things behind. It's time we stop thinking that the church rises and falls on our bank account, on, as excellent as it is, on the right music, on a perfect PowerPoint presentation, on a package that is so put together, so professional, that I can't tell the difference between a corporation and the church. Maybe it's time we leave behind, we depart for the wilderness and leave behind some of our childish ways. I ask this question of me and of us as a church. When was the last time you or we have done something that has no explanation except God? We are a very self-dependent people. Maybe it's time that the wilderness that is beckoning us calls us to depart where we have been and leave it behind. That's the first thing. The wilderness is a departure. Here's the second thing. The wilderness is a community. Here's what happens in 1 Samuel 22, beginning with verse 1. It says, David departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. And when his brothers and all his father's house heard it, they went down there to him. And then this is the part I like. And everyone who is in distress, and everyone who is in debt, and everyone who is bitter in soul. I like that. They gathered to him, and he became the commander over them. And with him there were, about 400 people. You see, the wilderness does call us to depart, but sometimes when we're in the wilderness, we think we're all alone. Have you ever walked through that brokenness and it feels like you're the only person in the world? Here's what this passage tells us. You're not alone. I know what we say. We talk about God. Well, God's with us, and that's true. But can I tell you, in my weak faith life, God, this is like heresy. You ready? In my weak faith life, God is not enough. I need others. And God recognized that all the way back, even before sin. It is not good that man should be alone because he's going to blow fingers off with firecrackers. Let's send him, let's make for him a woman, which means, whoa, man, right? Now, it is not good that man should be alone. That had nothing to do with sin. That was just God going, yeah, I know how this is going to go down, right? So community is important, but that word community does seem to get overused. Those of you who are extroverts hear this part and you're like, yes, community. We should get together this afternoon, and then tomorrow morning let's meet for breakfast, and we're going to pray. We're going to get together and pray, and we're going to study the Bible, and we should meet on Tuesday also. At some point, it stops being about prayer and Scripture and starts being about your need for me to give you energy by being present with you. Introverts here, like me and others of you, hear this idea of community, and we begin to sweat because we know how you extroverts are going to hear it. We begin to sweat. But you see, community is not about how often we can be together, how much time we spend together. It's not, or even how many people. Notice, there's about 400 people gathered. Here's what community is. Community is about recognizing that as weird as I feel, as alone as I feel, as isolated as I feel in this wilderness where it seems like I'm the only one, there are others around me who feel the exact same way. We do some of this together. It calls us to community. How do you survive the wilderness? Not alone. You will die. It will swallow you. Despair will become the last word of your life if you navigate this alone. And even as I say this, even as I read my own stupid words, I feel the conviction of God's Spirit upon me. Because some of you are just like me. And the worst thing in the world is being dependent upon somebody else. The hardest thing to accept is your own weakness, your own failure, your own need for others. And so we don't like to hear this. But community is not just so we have a companion along the way. Community is the only way we will ever navigate the wilderness, because by ourselves we get lost in it. But the community of the fellowship of believers or like-minded people. Notice the people that were gathered to David, they were weird. All of them. They were the ones in debt. Back then, you went to debtor's prison. They were the ones who were bitter in their spirits. They were the ones whom society had rejected. They were the ones who looked a lot like the same people Jesus attracted. And we see these people in the wilderness, and they look like wilderness people, like John the Baptizer, honey in their beard and locust wings hanging out, and he hasn't brushed his hair or his teeth, and he's wearing cam. We see these people, and we're like, these wilderness people, they're weird. And then we realize, oh, wait, I'm a wilderness person too. And somebody is looking at us going, oh, they're weird. I think this is part of the story. Let's be weird together. That sounds almost like a message for the 60s and 70s. But here it is. We need each other as much as those of us who like to live in our arrogance and our pride don't think so. I need you. I need you. I need you to know what being me even means. And you need me, and you need the person next to you. This is how it works. We're all in this crazy, desolate place together. So here it is. Wilderness is a departure. You got to leave the old in order to enter into the new. Wilderness as community. You cannot do this alone. And then this, wilderness as refuge. And I love this. In 1 Samuel 23, it says that David went to two different locations. You can see it in verse 14 and then in verse 29. And that he went into the wilderness, and the wilderness was his stronghold. Well, the wilderness is a dangerous place. How does the wilderness become a stronghold? How does the wilderness become a place of refuge? How does the wilderness become a place of safety? Wilderness as departure, wilderness as community, but now wilderness as refuge. This is the idea that what we consider safe is one of the most dangerous things we can do. We like our safety. We like our locked doors. We like our security systems. We like our cameras. We like to feel safe. We like to feel secure. But isn't it amazing? The more we do to make ourselves secure, the more insecure we get. We want the security of our retirement accounts, but we spend 20 years sweating over every fluctuation in the market. We don't feel very secure. But we're doing this to build our security. I'm not saying retirement accounts are bad. I'm not saying saving for the future is bad. I'm saying we have built our life of plans and backup to the backup plans, and none of them make us feel more secure. Here's the irony of the wilderness. It's dangerous. It's going to kill you. There's no way through it except to follow someone who has navigated the wilderness. And it's the safest place you can be. Because in the wilderness, you don't have to worry about tomorrow. In fact, you don't have the energy to worry about tomorrow. Your today has enough troubles of its own. And in the wilderness, you realize you can't even provide your own food. You can't provide your own water. So God says, how about some manna? Don't save it. Don't store it. We'll do this again tomorrow, but you got to trust me. How about some water? No, we don't need a brook. We don't need a stream. We don't need a river. How about a rock? Right? But you can't do it. And if you try to do it yourself, there's going to be consequences like Moses. You can't do it. This is a God thing. Here's what the wilderness does. The wilderness strips away all these things that we think we need, and it reveals the one thing we truly need. We become dependent upon God. It is our refuge. The psalmist writes, the name of the Lord is a strong tower, and the mighty run to it, and they are saved. He is our refuge. He is our strength. He is our ever-present help in times of need. Right? This is the thing. I don't think we want the wilderness because I don't think we want to be dependent upon God. But I think the one thing we need more than anything is to be dependent upon God. Here's been my prayer for myself, and whether you like it or not, for you guys as well this week. God, strip away all of the things that we think we need. Boy, we just spent $20,000 on 2 new air conditioning units and the furnaces that go with it. Because we need air conditioning. God, strip away all of the things we think we need. This is what the wilderness does, is it strips it away. But what we discover is when we get in the wilderness, all of these things that we thought we needed, we discover all of a sudden we don't need. We just don't need. And God says, let me be what you need, but you're going to have to trust me every step, every moment of the day. Hey, guess what, guys? There's no backup plan here. I'm all you've got. Can I challenge you, even as I challenge myself? When was the last time you did something without a backup plan? Without a way out? When was the last time you did something that the only explanation is God? Oh, I like my ordered world. I like my things. I like my blessings. I like my air conditioning. I like my soft chair. I like my TV. I like my remote. I like my control. I like these things, but are these things killing me? I think they're killing me more completely than the wilderness has ever threatened to kill me. Maybe it's time that I understand that the wilderness is a departure point and I leave behind those things that just don't matter. Maybe it's time that I understand that the wilderness is a community and I let people in closer than arm's length. Maybe it's time I realize that the wilderness is my only refuge because God alone is my only safe place. Where do you find yourself today? On the edge of the wilderness? Maybe it's time you leave behind all of those things and you take that step of faith. It's going to be hard. You're going to ask questions. You're going to doubt your faith. You're going to doubt your salvation. You're going to doubt the presence of God. You're going to doubt the people around you. You're going to doubt every answer that was ever given to you. You're going to doubt what your Sunday school teacher said, what your preacher has said. You're going to sometimes even doubt what the Bible says, but we need these things stripped away long enough to hear the voice of God in our life, calling us back into this radical following that God has called us to from the beginning. I know my soul aches and longs for this. In the end, we discover that the wilderness is the only path that brings us into the realm of God's kingdom, that is, his kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. Because in the wilderness, we finally discover who we have been and how we have defined ourselves while living in Saul's kingdom. And it's nothing more than just a vague illusion. Instead, when we depart our old lives of safety and abundance and easy answers, we will begin to discover the new life and the new kingdom that Christ offers. And additionally, we will discover that we are not alone. As we find within the wilderness community of broken people, people that are just as broken as I am, people that are just as broken as you are, and who are all in search of God's healing touch. That's community. These are our people. These are Jesus' people, whom Jesus draws to himself, those whom society ignores or forgets. You see, we are a community of Jesus' people who are discovering that the path through the wilderness is the only place where we will ever begin to fully encounter God. Jesus said, how do we get through the wilderness? He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He's the path. He's navigated the barren spaces, death itself. The only way out is through, and the only way through is the way, and the only way is Jesus. You see, this in turn will make our lives of abundance, what we term blessing. It will make all of this begin to seem meaningless and even lead us to despair. I think of that old chorus where it says, and the things of earth grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. This is where we find ourselves. But when we finally take refuge in the wilderness of questions and brokenness and despair, suddenly we will discover that God supplies everything we need. He even supplies our need itself. The psalmist says, the psalmist makes the comment that God will grant you the desires of your heart. It does not mean that God will give you whatever your pea-picking, as my mom always says, your pea-picking little heart wants. That's not what God is. He's not the candy man, the Santa Claus in the heavenlies. What that psalmist means, that God will give you the desires of your heart, it means he will take God desires and implant them in your life so that your desires are his desires are your desires. He will give you new desires. And this is where we find ourselves. All of this realm of Saul's reign is failing. It's all failing around us. We need to enter into the wilderness where we can finally find our refuge in Christ. This is the only place, the wilderness is the only place where you can find God's refuge, where you can encounter him every day, where you can learn that you are being remade into creatures fit for eternity. And there it is again, that word, that name, eternity. Immortality, infinity, that word that is stronger than life. We need a stronger word than life. What Pastor Knack called the stronger word, this immortality, and named that immortality as Christ. Here's the question. Will you walk with me? Will you walk with this company of misfits who have somehow found each other in the wilderness? Will you leave behind the hollow life of Saul's kingdom for the moment-by-moment dependence upon God? You see, it is not safe insofar as you are not in control. You are not in control, but it is the surest, the truest place to be. You see, in the wilderness, we finally encounter the immortal Christ, who is leading us to everlasting life. Immortality, indeed, a stronger name than life itself. One must be true to immortality. One must be true to Christ, says Pastor Knack. Only there will life become what it was always supposed to be, union with God. So, where are you today? Let me end with this, even as Stephen comes up and we prepare for this meal. Let me end with this. Let me end with what Jesus himself said. Whoever loves his life loses it. Whoever hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life. If anyone serves me, he must follow me. And where I am, there will my servants be also.